The ravens called at dawn with their bleak voices, as though they heralded the arrival of some dire tidings. A pale sun, high and cold, spilled weak light upon the towers of the Red Keep. Within those walls, a quiet shift had occurred, one that would shape the destiny of the Seven Kingdoms as profoundly as any war or wedding feast. King Robert Baratheon was still very much alive, though he bore the scars from his hunting accident not long past. He had survived the boar, though it nearly finished him, and the realm believed him back to health. Yet there was a hardness about him now, a grim resolve that tempered his once boisterous humor. Those who had known Robert in the rebellion, in the days of youthful vigor and hope, would hardly recognize the man who now prowled the throne room like a caged lion. He had lost something irretrievable when Eddard Stark was beheaded on the steps of the Great September of Baelor. Grief and guilt warred behind his eyes. Grief that his old friend was gone, guilt that he had allowed it, even if not by his hand directly, to transpire. It was an absurd tragedy of miscommunication and betrayal, and in the wake of it, in the smoldering ashes of Ned Stark's downfall, came the king's decision that stunned the entire court and all of Westeros. Robert Baratheon would put aside Queen Cersei Lannister and take to wife the eldest daughter of House Stark, Sansa. The tale was whispered in corridors and feast halls alike. A girl who had once been betrothed to Prince Joffrey, now claimed by the king himself. A betrothal abruptly broken, then overshadowed by a swift and unexpected alliance. Lips curled in scorn, brows arched in disbelief. Talk of scandal, talk of punishment, talk of cunning. For who but Robert could fling Cersei Lannister aside so casually? Surely the Lannisters would never allow such a slight to stand. Yet the notion that Sansa Stark, a child of the North, would be enthroned beside Robert was more than mere rumor. The king's small council strove to manage the realm's confusion. Littlefinger wore the same mocking smile he always did, as though all was proceeding according to some hidden design. Grand Maester Pycelle's hands shook with anxious tension. Varys's whispery voice echoed in the corners, spinning webs of intelligence no one else could unravel. Renly Baratheon, returned from a short absence from the capital, wore an expression of open incredulity. Above them all, King Robert had only to say, "Her father was my friend. I owe Eddard Stark what reparation I can give, however small." And the matter was settled, at least for the moment. The moment demanded a drastic solution. The realm teetered on the brink of chaos. Lords in the Riverlands and the North roiled with rage over Ned Stark's execution. They claimed the Lannisters had orchestrated it, that the king had turned a blind eye, that King's Landing was rife with treachery. Robert had awakened from his near-fatal wound to discover Ned's trial had gone awry, that Cersei and Joffrey, in a fit of what they called righteous anger, had ordered Eddard Stark's head. By the time Robert could command them to stay their hand, the blade had already fallen, and the king's roar of fury echoed in the Red Keep. Then had come the truth. Jaime was father to Cersei's children. None of them were Robert's. He had been cuckolded and made a fool. With every hour that passed, Robert's rage grew until it was a physical force, swirling in the corridors, impossible to escape. If not for Pycelle's calming potions, if not for the soothing words of Varys and the honey-sweet manipulations of Littlefinger, Robert might have put King's Landing itself to the torch. They told him the North was poised to rebel. They told him the young wolf, Robb Stark, had called his banners. In the confusion, Renly had tried to stake a claim to the throne. Stannis had also emerged from Dragonstone to denounce the children of Cersei as abominations and press his own rights. Through this chaos, Robert looked at a map of the Seven Kingdoms, blood pounding in his ears, and demanded a remedy. The remedy, it seemed, was to ensure the North did not rise. If Eddard could not be brought back, then the memory of their friendship must be honored in some fashion. "He was my brother in arms," Robert declared in the council chamber, voice hoarse. "He died while I was bedridden. I will not have the North rebel against me. I will show them we remain united." And so, within a fortnight, he declared his marriage to Cersei Lannister null and void, naming her adultery as cause, exiling her to face whatever fate the court decided. But to secure the North, to quell the howling wolves, he would wed Sansa Stark. Before any man could voice an objection, Robert had fixed them with a look that halted debate in their throats. He would see it done, he said, if he had to ride 1,000 leagues to fetch the girl himself. They found Sansa in her bedchamber. She was pale with grief, having lost her father, kept as a hostage. She had tried so desperately to intervene on her father's behalf, to speak to Joffrey's mercy, only to watch in horror as the boy king ordered her father's execution anyway. The memory haunted her. She had lost all illusions she once held about beautiful knights and chivalrous kings. So when a group of royal guards came to fetch her, she expected some further cruelty. The king himself stood in the corridor, broad-shouldered, eyes fever-bright with sorrow and wrath. In the torchlight, his face looked weathered, haunted by ghosts of war. Gently, he informed her of his decision, voice thick with some emotion she could not name. He said it was to honor her father. He said it was to keep the realm from shattering. She felt tears scald her eyes, for she was still grieving, and fear coiled within her. The notion of wedding a man old enough to have been a comrade to her own father felt surreal, yet everything in King's Landing had come unmoored from sense since her father's head fell. She remembered, in half-dazed clarity, the many times her father had spoken of Robert as a dear friend. She knew how he'd loved King Robert as a brother. Would he have wished this? She could not say, but she also knew that to refuse the king would be impossible. And somewhere in the swirl of her horror, there was a faint glimmer of relief at no longer being betrothed to Joffrey. The wedding day was subdued, shadowed by the tensions that lay like a miasma over the capital. The great September of Baelor was decorated in northern pine and Baratheon gold. But the hush among the onlookers told a different story. The bride appeared in a gown of pale gray, her hair arranged in the style of the southern courts, a ghost of the innocent child who had once dreamed of gallant princes. The king, clad in gilded black and gold, looked more warrior than husband. There were no cheers of rapture as they joined hands. The High Septon read the rites, and the hush never broke. It felt more like a funeral for the realm's illusions than a royal wedding. Even the bells, which chimed in announcement, sounded like a lament. Cersei was nowhere to be seen. She had been confined to her chambers, pending further investigation into her crimes. Joffrey hovered with a thunderous face, lips pressed tight with jealousy, confusion, and the sting of paternal rejection. No one was satisfied. Not the king's advisors, not Sansa's remaining retinue, not the watchers from every corner. The only possible solace was that this marriage might stay the North's wrath. That night, King Robert and his new queen did not host a grand feast but a far quieter supper in the small hall with a few lords loyal to House Baratheon and a smattering of northern bannermen who had come under safe conduct. Sansa felt the weight of every stare. She dined in near silence, rarely meeting anyone's eyes. She felt lost, a traveler in a strange land with no map or guide, her childhood destroyed along with her father. When Robert offered her a morsel from his own plate, it felt stilted, forced. She could recall her father's words once upon a time. The king is a man like any other, yet she could not reconcile that with the uneasy hush of the room. The man beside her was enormous, a presence that seemed to suck the air from the chamber. He was not the jolly, boisterous Robert she had glimpsed when she first arrived in King's Landing. This Robert was bitter and mournful, weighed down by betrayal. His wry half-smile resembled a half-grimace. Still, he offered a soft word to her in that stentorian voice. "I will make this right, Sansa. I swear it." She managed only a nod. In the days that followed, confusion reigned in King's Landing. Where once had been the Lannisters' sure grip on the throne, there now spread an air of disquiet. Jaime Lannister still remained in captivity within the city under suspicion of treason for fathering the royal children. Tyrion Lannister, once hand of the king in a different turn of events, had been dispatched somewhere in the chaos, or so rumor claimed. Some said he had fled the city with his cell's word. Others claimed Varys kept him hidden. Cersei, locked away in her gilded cage, spat fury in every direction. Yet the king's word was absolute, and if he willed that she remain imprisoned, it would be so. Now the crown was reliant upon new supporters. Robert's brother, Renly, spoke carefully, uncertain how this sudden union might affect his own ambitions. Stannis brooded far away on Dragonstone. Robb Stark still commanded a host in the field, uncertain whether to lay siege to the capital or bend the knee. Scouts brought word that the River Lords, outraged by the injustice done to Ned Stark, still teetered on the edge of rebellion. In that fractious climate, every envoy, every letter bore the weight of 1,000 swords. The new queen's presence in the castle was a tangible symbol of peace, at least to the hopeful. Sansa's days passed in a blur of lessons on how to conduct herself as queen. She had never imagined, even in her wildest fantasies, that she would ascend to that title, especially not in this manner. Septa Mordane was gone, parted from her in the chaos of Ned's downfall. Now Sansa found herself guided by ladies of the court who offered stiff courtesy, if only because she was the king's wife. Marjorie Tyrell was still in the capital, courtesy of one marriage proposal or another, though uncertain how the shifting alliances might favor Highgarden. She offered Sansa cautious kindness, speaking in hushed tones about the precariousness of life in the Red Keep. There were other ladies too, those who had once fawned over Cersei but now sought to ingratiate themselves with the new queen. Sansa listened, always polite, but a deep sadness lodged in her heart. She missed her mother, her siblings, her home. The old dream of being a graceful southern lady felt like a cruel joke. The Iron Throne loomed large in her mind, a seat forged from 1,000 swords, each representing centuries of violence. She supposed it was only fitting that all this heartbreak coiled around that monstrous chair. King Robert, for his part, spent long hours in the council chamber hearing reports of the realm's unrest. He called for quiet in the Riverlands, demanded the North remain loyal, and sent ravens to every lord who might stand with him. Some days, Sansa would see him pass by with an escort of gold cloaks, his face carved from stone. He offered her fleeting kindness as though each time he saw her, he remembered Ned Stark anew. She sometimes caught him gazing at her with an expression akin to regret. He never drank to the degree he had once done, never wore that half-drunken grin that had become so notorious. The king was sober, grim, and carrying the weight of the monarchy like a chain around his neck. The court whispered that Robert Baratheon had grown old before his time. Others suggested the ghosts of his betrayal haunted him. But no one spoke too loudly, not where the new queen might hear. Out of some deference to her innocence or to the memory of Ned Stark, they held their tongues. And so, the days marched on. Each morning, Sansa would attend her lessons and attempt to navigate the labyrinth of courtly manners, reminding herself never to trust too readily or to speak too freely, for she had learned the deadly price of naivety. Each afternoon, she might walk in the gardens, flanked by a pair of guards, to breathe the perfumed air of lemon trees she once loved. She no longer found that scent quite so lovely. At twilight, she dined with the king and a handful of lords or ladies, the talk ever turning to war or the threat of it. Robert would give her a courteous nod, pass a remark or two on the day's events, then speak at length with his men. She felt like an ornament, some piece of silverware placed at the table for decorative effect. But she persevered, reminding herself that, for the sake of the North, for the sake of the realm, she must play her part. She thought of her mother, somewhere in the Riverlands perhaps, or returned to Winterfell in mourning. She thought of Robb, possibly leading an army that might soon clash with the king's forces. The horror of that notion kept her awake at night. An unspoken question hung in the air: if war came, where would Robert's new wife's loyalties truly lie? Eventually, a raven arrived from the north. Robb Stark agreed to parley, though he made no promises, demanded justice for his father's death and the safe return of Sansa and Arya if Arya still lived. The rumor was that Arya had escaped the city before the execution, vanished into the streets, and no one had a clear idea of where she might be. Robert read the message in silence, face taut as a drawn bowstring. Then he summoned Sansa. He told her plainly that the boy they now called the young wolf had no intention of bending the knee unless certain demands were met. He has every right to be angry, Robert admitted. Ned was my friend, your father. I should have protected him. But what's done is done, and we must find a way forward. Sansa, voice trembling, asked if Robb would attack. Robert shook his head. Not if we give him reason to stand down. You can help me show him that House Stark and House Baratheon remain allied. Sansa did not know how she could possibly help. She was only a girl out of her depth in these matters of war and vengeance. But that same day, Robert had her pen a letter to Robb. She wrote carefully, pouring out her sorrow for the loss of their father, her longing to see home, her cautious plea for unity rather than bloodshed. She spoke also of the king's promise to punish those truly responsible for Ned's death, which Robert had vowed would include Cersei, Joffrey, and those who had conspired with them. Her words were sincere, if uncertain. She hoped Robb would understand she wrote under no duress, though, in truth, she felt every eye upon her as she composed it. When the raven took wing, she found herself trembling with an odd mixture of fear and hope. A fortnight later, the city buzzed with rumors. Robb Stark had agreed to send envoys. A handful of northern lords, Great John Umber, Ser Helman Tallheart, and Galbart Glover, arrived in the capital under the strictest guarantee of safe passage. They were escorted into the throne room where the Iron Throne glowered in the candlelight. The king sat there, immense and foreboding, a battered copper crown on his dark hair. To his right stood his queen, Sansa, draped in the colors of House Stark, gray and white silk embroidered with the dire wolf of her house. To the left were members of the small council. The Northerners, though obviously brimming with anger and sorrow, bent the knee with grim courtesy. Sansa caught sight of Great John Umber, the huge man who had once roared with laughter around her father's table. But his face was stony now, his posture stiff. The tension in the room was a living thing. Robert rose, and in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder, he acknowledged them as faithful bannermen of the North and said he wished to heal the wounds left by Ned Stark's death. He swore upon the old gods and the new that justice would be done. Sansa felt tears prick her eyes when she heard him name Joffrey as a pretender, the product of incest between Cersei and Jaime, the pair now awaiting their reckoning. This was a public unveiling of the Lannisters' secret. It set tongues wagging across the realm and in the Red Keep itself. To Sansa's surprise, Robert did not flinch from proclaiming that he had failed Ned Stark by letting the realm fall under the sway of the Lannisters. He said that he would repay that debt by honoring Ned's memory in every way he could and by binding the North to the crown anew in a union that would protect them all from chaos. He gestured at Sansa. She stood with her head high, though inside she trembled. He called her his true queen and told the Northerners that, together, they would usher in a new peace. Afterward, in a private audience in the small council chamber, the Northern envoys spoke with quiet fury. They demanded to know what punishment had befallen those who orchestrated the travesty at Baelor's September. When told that Joffrey was in a secure tower cell, his fate to be decided, that Cersei was likewise imprisoned, and that Jaime was under guard in the dungeons, they grimly nodded. They made it clear, however, that Robb Stark would not accept half measures. The blood of the Northmen cried for vengeance. Robert, jaw clenched, said, "Vengeance is best served by justice. I will see them pay for the murders they've done." The Great John hammered a fist on the table, making the wine pitchers jump, and declared that if the king did not make good on that vow, the North would rise, bride or no bride. Robert's face darkened, and for a heartbeat, Sansa feared a violent clash. But Robert only rumbled, "Then let me show you. I've not forgotten how to mete out justice, and I've not forgotten Ned Stark." There was a certain Stark sincerity in his words, and perhaps the Great John recognized it. Their parted ways remained tenuous, but for the moment, the threat of open war receded. Sansa took a breath of relief. Yet it would take time to arrange formal trials, weigh evidence, and piece together the labyrinth of the Lannisters' machinations. Meanwhile, the realm stirred with the news. The king had discarded the Lannister queen, exposed her children as bastards, and married the Stark girl. Whispers flew from Dorne to the Vale to the Iron Islands. Some lords reeled from this new alignment. Others seized the opportunity to assert claims or nurse grudges. Stannis Baratheon, in particular, was outraged, for he believed he was the rightful heir should Robert be proven childless. Did not the laws of inheritance flow next to the king's elder brother if all the king's offspring were bastards? But Robert's new marriage threw a wrench into that, for now the king might father an heir recognized by all, especially if the union with a Stark reaffirmed the crown's legitimacy. Rumor said Stannis was gathering ships for a siege if matters did not align themselves in his favor. Renly, younger and more charming, watched from the wings, uncertain if the realm might prefer him. The Tyrells waited to see which Baratheon to favor. House Arryn, still reeling from the death of Jon Arryn, kept half its gates closed. Each region seemed to hold its breath. Among all these swirling tensions, Sansa dwelled in the Red Keep, learning day by day the precarious nature of power. She began to see the subtle changes in Robert's demeanor. The first time she glimpsed him do something unexpectedly gentle was in the royal gardens. She had gone there alone, wanting a moment of quiet. But the king was there as well, dismissed his guards to a respectful distance, gazing at the rows of roses that had once been Cersei's pride. In her father's memory, Sansa mustered the courage to speak to him. "Your Grace," she said softly. He turned. In his eyes flickered a sorrow that she recognized, a sorrow she still carried each day since Ned's death. He asked her, quietly, whether she truly hated him for all that had happened. She knew not how to answer. "I do not hate you," she murmured, voice trembling. I only do not understand. Could we not have saved my father somehow? The question was dangerously close to blaming him. Robert closed his eyes and pressed his lips into a grim line. I ask myself that every day, girl, he said, the words strangled in his throat. The boar wounded me so gravely. I was near death. While I lay abed, the vipers slithered about, and by the time I rose, your father was gone. This is my greatest regret in all my wretched life. His voice was thick, sincerity raw on his face. The quiet hush that followed felt profound. Something in Sansa's heart twisted. She found herself wanting to believe him, believing he had not willed Ned's end. Days became weeks, and in that time Robert began to consult Sansa about northern matters, seeking to know how the Starks thought, what Ned would have done, how best to reconcile with the lords of the north. He even asked her about the Tullys in Riverrun, her mother's family. She answered with hesitant care, telling him about her mother's pride and her uncle's fierceness, how the Tullys valued honor. He listened more intently than she expected, nodding at intervals. At feasts, he would now ensure she was included in the conversation, rather than left silent at his side. His manner was still rough, at times abrupt, but there was a marked difference. When the Braavosi envoys came to treat for trade rights, he had her remain at the council table, remarking that if she were to be his queen, she might as well learn the burdens of ruling. The small council looked askance, but Robert's words stood. By the night's end, Sansa felt more weary than she had imagined possible, her mind swimming with talk of coin and shipping lanes. But Robert placed a heavy hand on her shoulder and told her she had done well, and she realized with some surprise that she was relieved. A tiny flicker of gratitude warmed her chest, though she still felt the ache of loss overshadow everything. Meanwhile, the city seethed. The Lannister loyalists had not vanished. They lurked in corners, fuming that their golden lion was in chains. Merchants complained that trade with the Westerlands had collapsed. Rumors circulated that Tywin Lannister was massing troops in the west, outraged that his daughter and son were imprisoned. The king's men insisted Tywin must answer for the crimes of his children, but those loyal to the Lannisters demanded the king's men answer for humiliating their proud house. It was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Varys whispered that an assassin's blade might be the next step. Robert doubled his guard, posted loyal men at every gate, and had the gold cloaks carry out nightly sweeps to seize any cut purses or troublemakers. Yet King's Landing never slept easy. Marjorie Tyrell's presence signaled that House Tyrell remained poised, watching. The Martells of Dorne had not forgotten their old vendettas. The Vale, the Iron Islands, the Stormlands, no corner of Westeros was certain what path to follow. On the day they brought Joffrey before the King's Justice, the Red Keep thrummed with tension. The boy, hair golden like his mother's, glared defiantly at them all. He was no longer king. He was simply a bastard child of incest, stripped of claim. Yet he sneered at Robert and spat at Sansa when she entered the hall. "You are nothing," he hissed. "I should have had you whipped for your insolence when I was king." Sansa flinched, a memory of how she had once believed this boy to be the embodiment of all her dreamy songs. The crowd parted for her, uneasy. She was the queen now, and in her gentle eyes flickered a strength Joffrey had never recognized. Robert clenched his fists. He loomed over Joffrey, demanded he kneel and confess his crimes, the murder of Ned Stark, the torment of Sansa. Joffrey laughed. "I did as I pleased. I was the king. You were never my father." The defiance cut Robert to the bone. Sansa saw him grit his teeth, struggling not to let fury consume him. Then he gave the order. Joffrey would be sent to the Night's Watch if he confessed. Otherwise, the penalty for regicide, slaying the hand of the king, who was as the king's own voice, was death. For a moment, it seemed Joffrey might choose pride and certain doom, but in the end, he quailed, seeing the steel in Robert's glare, the reflection of the warhammer that had once felled princes on the trident. He fell to his knees, voice trembling, and confessed. A hush fell. Robert flicked a glance to Sansa, then to the watchers. The sentence was swift. Joffrey would take the black, forswear all lands and titles, and live out his days on the wall. Few in the hall seemed satisfied. The Lannister loyalists clamored that he was too young. The Northerners muttered that the punishment was too mild. But the king stood firm, and Joffrey Baratheon Lannister was led away in shackles. Sansa exhaled a shaky breath. In the days after, Robert told Sansa in private that he knew the sentence was lenient, but he wanted to avoid giving the Lannisters a martyr. If Joffrey died by the sword, the Westerlands might rise with renewed fury. Sending him to the wall was a compromise that stripped him of power and future, without feeding the legend of a murdered prince. Sansa wondered if that was justice enough for the father she had lost. But she saw that Robert was thinking as a king must, balancing the realm's stability with vengeance. She only prayed it would suffice. Cersei's trial followed. That too was a spectacle. She was brought forth, hair shorn, wearing a tattered gown, her green eyes blazing with hatred. She did not kneel even under threat. She spat accusations at Robert, called him a usurper, bellowed that she had only saved the throne for her son's rightful inheritance. Some in the hall believed her twisted logic. Many others reviled her. The evidence of her incest was overwhelming. She had conspired with Joffrey to ensure Ned Stark's death. The city was transfixed by the drama, the crowds outside seething with bloodlust. In the end, Robert pronounced a sentence of life imprisonment in a gilded tower. Her children declared bastards with no inheritance. The Lannisters cursed him for a tyrant. The Northerners muttered again that beheading might be more fitting. But the king gave the same reasoning. A public execution could inflame Tywin Lannister's wrath and bring the realm to open war. If Cersei lingered in captivity, Tywin would have limited cause to proclaim a vendetta. Some saw cunning in this choice. Others saw cowardice. Sansa recalled how her father had spoken of mercy once, though he died for it. She could hardly bear to look upon Cersei, remembering the woman who had sneered at her pleas. For a moment, Sansa almost wished Robert had demanded the block. But she, too, understood the precarious game they played. As for Jaime, the Kingslayer, he had been a lesser participant in the plot against Ned Stark, but his guilt in fathering Cersei's children was unquestionable. Robert had him stripped of his white cloak, every honor obliterated. He was to remain imprisoned pending further negotiation with Tywin Lannister. Some whispered an exchange might be arranged, perhaps to keep the West from rising. And so, the Lannisters were thoroughly broken within King's Landing, their once iron grip shattered. The city heaved a collective sigh, though whether from relief or from the dread of what might come next, no one could say. Amid these storms, the king's new queen continued to try and find her footing. She was 16 now, still young but older in soul than her years. She had endured the horror of her father's death, the forced betrothal to Joffrey, and now a marriage to a king who was once her father's closest friend. Gradually, she gleaned that Robert was not a heartless brute. He was a man shaped by war and betrayal, haunted by regrets. His attempts to shield her from the uglier side of ruling were ham-handed, often overshadowed by his formidable temper. Yet she saw flickers of kindness. He tried to keep her informed of major decisions. He made time to ask her about the North, about her memories of Winterfell's Godswood. He asked her once about her favorite songs, and she, timidly, named the ballads of Florian and Jonquil. He snorted, but said nothing scornful. Sometimes, late at night, she heard him pacing, as though sleep eluded him. She wondered if the ghosts of the trident and the boar that nearly killed him still prowled his mind. Her new position forced her to become a mediator of sorts between the northern lords who filtered into the city and the king's men. She found the courage to speak softly in the Greyjohn's ear, to remind him that vengeance would not bring Ned back, that only unity could protect the North from the chaos that threatened the entire realm. She told him that her father had always believed in Robert's honor, even when the king stumbled astray, and that her father would have wanted no further bloodshed between old friends. The great Jon, for all his bluster, relented somewhat. And so, inch by inch, Sansa Stark's presence at court soothed some of the worst hostilities, not through cunning or manipulation, but by a gentle sort of sincerity that even hardened warriors respected. She was, after all, Ned Stark's daughter. The memory of her father's honor shone through her. News came at last that Robb Stark himself would travel south to meet with the king. He was bringing his mother, Lady Catelyn, as well as a retinue of loyal bannermen. The day this was announced, Sansa felt her heart lurch. She had not seen her mother or her brother since that terrible day in the September of Baelor. She could scarcely breathe from the longing to throw herself into her mother's arms, to beg forgiveness for not stopping Joffrey's cruelty, to be a child again. But she was no child. She was Queen of the Seven Kingdoms, wife to Robert Baratheon. When they arrived, the city roiled with excitement and anxiety. The last time a Stark came south, it ended in tragedy. Perhaps this time would be different. Sansa waited in the throne room with Robert, her hands clenched around a white handkerchief, the hush of the court pressing in on her. The main doors opened. Robb Stark entered, tall for his age, cloaked in gray fur. He wore the mantle of a war leader, youthful but with eyes older than his years. At his side stood Lady Catelyn, hair threaded with silver, face carved by sorrow. Sansa's breath caught. She saw the flicker of tears in her mother's eyes, though Lady Catelyn tried to remain composed. Robb approached. His voice was calm, but there was a tension coiled in every syllable when he greeted the king. The great hall seemed to hold its breath. Robert rose from the Iron Throne, descending the steps with a measured tread. He stood before the young wolf, dwarfed him in height, but there was something formidable about Robb as well, a quiet dignity inherited from Ned. Robert offered a short bow of his head. "I welcome you to King's Landing as an ally, Lord Stark," he said. No grand speeches, no flamboyant gestures. Robb inclined his head in reply, neither groveling nor presumptuous. "Your Grace," he responded, "I come for justice and for peace, if it can be had." A hush. Then Robert glanced at Sansa. "Your sister, the Queen, awaits you." And so, Robb turned to look at her, real emotion cracking the facade. Sansa took a few steps forward, heart pounding, and met him. They did not embrace before the entire court, but their gaze held. It was enough to make the crowd murmur. They were siblings reunited after tragedy, a living testament to the old bonds that had once bound House Stark and the crown. Then Lady Catelyn came forth, eyes upon her daughter. She stepped around the dais, ignoring the protocol, and Sansa forgot all queenly decorum. She rushed into her mother's arms, tears finally spilling. The hush deepened. Even Robert seemed to avert his eyes as though giving them privacy. For a moment, Sansa was simply a daughter again, weeping into her mother's shoulder. She felt her mother trembling too. Then, as the moment stretched, Lady Catelyn quietly told her, "We have much to speak of, my sweet girl." Sansa nodded, tears wet on her cheeks. She glanced back at Robert, half afraid he might take offense. But he only met her gaze and gave a stiff nod as if granting them the time they needed. So began the delicate negotiations. Robb Stark demanded the rightful punishment of those who had orchestrated Ned's death. Robert explained his reasons for sparing Joffrey and Cersei. Tension rippled across the table. Lady Catelyn's eyes flashed with anger, but she too saw the necessity of avoiding total war. Word arrived that Tywin Lannister was massed at Harrenhal, uncertain whether to march or sue for peace. Robert insisted that, for the good of the realm, the time for Baratheons and Starks to close ranks was now. They must not tear the realm apart for the satisfaction of a few heads. Robb listened, but it was Lady Catelyn who spoke. Ned was an honorable man. He believed in justice, but also in protecting the innocent. If more war comes, countless innocents will die. I do not know if I have the strength to forgive the Lannisters, yet I will not plunge the realm into fire over vengeance alone. Her voice wavered. Robert nodded, meeting her eyes with surprising gentleness. I will not deny you the right to see them answer for their crimes. But we cannot do so in a way that costs thousands of lives. Let them rot in their tower cells, see them stripped of titles. Let them vanish from the pages of history unlamented. Lady Catelyn pressed her lips together. The pain of Ned's death was too fresh, but perhaps time would allow that wound to scar rather than bleed. Finally, she sighed. We will see what can be done. Later that evening, when mother and daughter were alone in Sansa's new chambers, the facade dropped and they let their hearts speak plainly. Sansa poured out her guilt that she had once believed Joffrey to be a fine prince, that she had not saved her father. Lady Catelyn held her, whispered that blame belonged to the treacheries of the Lannisters. Then Sansa spoke of her marriage. She admitted she did not love Robert Baratheon, but that he was not the monster she had feared. He was sorrowful and penitent. Lady Catelyn frowned, uncertain. He is the king. Kings can seldom afford to be kind, she murmured. But if he treats you well, that is something. Your father did love him once, as a brother. Sansa felt a sudden pang. Was that enough for a marriage? She could not say. She could only vow to remain strong, to do what Ned Stark would have wanted, preserve peace, protect the innocent, serve honor. Lady Catelyn wiped her tears, saying softly, that is all any of us can do. Negotiations continued into the following weeks. Robb Stark spent time with Robert and Sansa both, forging a tentative rapport. The king would sometimes reminisce about Ned's prowess, how they had marched together in Robert's rebellion. Robb listened solemn. He was wise enough to see that Robert carried genuine remorse. Yet the memory of Ned's end still stung. Meanwhile, word arrived that Tywin Lannister had sent envoys to treat for the release of Jaime. They demanded Cersei's freedom too, but Robert was unmoved. The question loomed, would the realm break into another civil war, or could the king's new alliance with House Stark prevent that? For the moment, the Seven Kingdoms waited to see. In the streets of King's Landing, talk was that the wolves had come to the capital without bloodshed. The smallfolk hoped that meant safer roads, cheaper bread, and a stable kingdom. The realm was tired of violence. One night, while the crisp air of autumn stole through the shutters, Robert and Sansa walked along the ramparts overlooking Blackwater Bay. The sky was dark, studded with stars. Torches flickered in the courtyard below. She felt the wind tug at her hair, and she closed her eyes, imagining she could taste the cold of the north on the breeze. Robert halted, resting his hands on the stone merlons. Your mother and your brother will leave soon, he said quietly. We've reached an agreement that might hold the realm together. They've asked for you to return north if you wish. Sansa's heart lurched. They have, she whispered. She had dreamed of escaping King's Landing, of returning to Winterfell, yet the idea of leaving behind the webs of responsibility she now held felt complicated. Robert nodded, jaw tight. I told them you're free to go if that is your wish. A long pause. Is it Sansa? She swallowed, searching her heart. She could see the sorrow in his eyes, the acceptance that he might lose this final bond with Ned Stark. She looked out over the sea, recalling her father's voice, his unwavering honor. I am your queen, she said slowly. To leave you now, at the moment when the realm is still fragile, would that not betray what my father stood for? Robert's breath was audible in the hush. Ned would want you safe, he said, voice thick. She nodded, tears trembling on her lashes. Yes, but he would also want me to do what is right for the realm, for the north, and for the crown. And right now, that is to remain. I cannot abandon the position I've been placed in. If I can help preserve peace, then I must. The king closed his eyes, a tension in his face easing. Sansa, he murmured. He did not finish the sentence, but she sensed the gratitude there. When Robb and Lady Catelyn prepared to depart, they met Sansa in the courtyard. The morning sun glimmered on the stone, and the Red Keep's walls seemed less foreboding. Robb embraced her at last, the stiff formality replaced by a fierce brotherly hug. Are you certain you won't come with us? He asked, voice hushed. She nodded, holding back tears. I must stay. For father's memory. For the realm. He studied her eyes and seemed to accept her choice. Lady Catelyn stroked her daughter's cheek, sadness and pride mingling. You have grown much since I last saw you, she whispered. Your father would be proud. Sansa squeezed her hand, words caught in her throat. She watched them ride away with the northern banner men, the sigil of the dire wolf fluttering in the breeze. A part of her yearned to gallop after them, to leave these treacherous walls behind. But she stayed, shoulders squared, chin high, forcing herself to remember that she was a Stark and now a Baratheon as well. She had a duty, a purpose that transcended her own heartbreak. So the new order in King's Landing took shape. Robert moved quickly to reorganize the small council, placing men he deemed trustworthy in key positions, often turning to Sansa for insight on those from the north. He installed Ser Barristan and Selmy as Lord Commander of the King's Guard anew, effectively purging the men who had blindly served Joffrey. Barristan, white-haired and proud, gave Sansa a small bow whenever they crossed paths, as if silently apologizing for the horrors she endured. The gold cloaks were placed under a new commander sworn to House Baratheon. The city's merchants gradually reopened trade with the Westerlands, though tension remained. Tywin Lannister hovered like a storm cloud on the horizon, but with his heirs disgraced and imprisoned, his options were limited. Rumor had it that he brooded in Harrenhal, sending ravens to each corner of the realm, looking for an advantage. For now, there was none to be found. The Starks held the loyalty of the north, the Tully. The Riverlands, and the king's seat was more secure each day. The The Martells and Tyrells, once overshadowed by the Lannisters, seemed inclined to support the new Baratheon-Stark alliance, if only to diminish Lannister influence. The Vale was quieter than it had been in years. Even the Iron Islands had retreated into sullen neutrality for the moment. In the Red Keep, Sansa found her days drifting into a new routine. She attended the king's side for court sessions, listening to petitions from lords, merchants, and common folk. She was not always called upon to speak, but she saw that Robert was mindful of her presence, occasionally turning to her for an opinion when matters concerned the North or when he believed a gentler voice might help. It was not the sort of queenship she had once imagined, full of courtly love and frothy gowns and adoring crowds. It was, instead, a quiet partnership built upon the memory of Ned Stark and the necessity of rebuilding a realm on the brink of war. There were nights when Robert would speak to her of the rebellion, how he had once idolized Lyanna Stark, how her death had shaped him into a bitter man. Sansa listened, uncertain how to respond. She was not Lyanna, and Robert did not delude himself that she was. Yet, in some strange twist of fate, he had found himself tied to another Stark. He seemed determined not to fail this time. Sometimes his face would cloud, and he would say, "I loved your father, did you know that? I loved him like a brother. I'd give half my years to go back and save him." She believed him. And though it could never bring Ned back, that shared grief bound them in a way. Winter drew closer, the nights turning colder even in the southern capital. Courtiers murmured about harvests and the need to build up stores. Robert placed the realm's resources on a surer footing, determined that if winter brought famine, the crown would not be caught unprepared. Sansa, guided by Margaery Tyrell, arranged charitable distributions of bread and stew to the city's poorest districts, a gesture meant to soothe the small folks' hardships. She recalled how her father had always cared for the people under his protection, ensuring they had enough to survive the harsh northern snows. She tried to do the same in the south, knowing well that hungry peasants would be the first to rise in revolt should times grow desperate. The new queen earned a measure of cautious respect from the smallfolk. They remembered her father's fate, recognized she was striving to do good. That year, the King's Landing winter relief was more organized than any in recent memory. A subtle sense of stability returned to the capital, though only time would reveal if it could last. On a chilly afternoon, Sansa found herself alone in the Godwood, a small cluster of weirwood trees that had been cultivated in the Red Keep long ago. She had come to pray, or at least to sit in silence as she once had in Winterfell's Godwood. She knelt by the pool, the reflection of her face rippling in the water. She almost did not hear Robert's approach. He was surprisingly quiet for such a large man. He stopped, uncertain, and then stepped forward, clearing his throat. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he said, voice softer than usual. She shook her head. "It's quite all right." He hesitated, glancing at the carved weirwood faces that seemed to watch them in eternal silence. "I never cared for the old gods," he admitted. "I always found them distant. But Ned was devout in his own way." She nodded, feeling that ache again. Yes, he was. They fell quiet. Then Robert rumbled, "Sometimes I come here to ask his forgiveness. Foolish, I know. A tree can't answer me." Sansa's eyes stung. She stood and faced him. "Not so foolish," she whispered. "Father would hear you if he could." He looked at her, at the sincerity in her gaze, and for a moment he let the mask slip. All the anger, the regret, the sorrow flickered across his face. Without a word, he turned back to the weirwoods. Sansa placed a hand gently on his arm, and the old gods bore silent witness to the fleeting, fragile moment of understanding between them. The months rolled on, and though tensions flared in various corners of Westeros, no full-blown war erupted. The threat of Tywin Lannister gradually receded, especially when ravens brought word that House Tyrell had massed a formidable host near Casterly Rock, effectively hemming in Tywin's forces. With no path to victory and his children disgraced, the old lion found himself forced to negotiate. The swirl of alliances had changed. House Tyrell demanded favorable trade concessions to keep him contained, and Robert did not object. The Dornish, for their part, demanded justice for Elia Martell's murder decades before, but with the Lannisters already brought low, a measure of symbolic reparations was arranged. So the Game of Thrones continued, but the Baratheon-Stark alliance provided the anchor that the realm needed. In this uneasy peace, the king's new marriage did something few had believed possible. It brought a measure of stability after years of Lannister dominance. Sansa, though, never forgot the tragedies that led here. She visited her father's tomb. Robert had granted the Starks permission to return Ned's remains to the crypts of Winterfell, but a small sept in King's Landing had been dedicated as well, with a statue in Ned's likeness. She placed flowers there from time to time, singing softly under her breath an old song he used to appreciate. Each time she did, she felt her father's presence and prayed she would make him proud. She had grown into a young queen who understood the precarious nature of power and the necessity of forging alliances not with illusions but with acts of sincerity. She and Robert rarely spoke of love, for theirs was not a love match. Yet, with time, a respect grew between them. Sansa found that he listened more than he once did, no longer drowning every frustration in drink. He occasionally joined her in the gardens or even at the archery butts, reminiscent of how Ned had taught her siblings. She was not the archer Arya might be, but she tried, and Robert actually smiled, truly smiled, not the bitter, haunted grin that once had marred his face. He even laughed once, a booming sound that startled the nearby courtiers. It was an echo of the man he had been in his youth, and for a fleeting moment, Sansa saw a glimpse of that charismatic rebel who had won the hearts of so many. Perhaps Ned's spirit was stirring something in him, a desire to be better than the cynic he had become. Time wove onward. The realm's lords gradually recognized that the iron bond between House Baratheon and House Stark would not easily be broken. The small folk began to adapt, praising the young queen with stories that she was gentle but firm, that she had tamed the lion's excesses and guided the stag away from ruin. Merchants found that the roads north, once blocked by threats of war, were safer. Over the course of the year, Sansa presided over a handful of court events, forging friendships with ladies from various regions, listening to their concerns, learning from her mistakes. Marjorie Tyrell quietly guided her in building alliances among the women of the court, a subtlety Sansa had never before grasped. She discovered that her childhood dream of being a graceful court lady was now overshadowed by the reality of queenship, yet she did not entirely abandon the sweet illusions. She simply tempered them with what she had learned. Dresses and courtesies still had their place, but behind them lay the steel of House Stark. When word reached the capital that the Greyjoys were stirring, testing the North's coastline, Robb Stark responded swiftly, repelling the raids. Robert had considered riding north to show support, but Sansa advised him that sending supplies or ships might be more prudent. She knew how to interpret her brother's pride. Robert took her counsel. With that gesture, a small threat was defused before it could become a crisis. Each such moment reinforced a new reality. The king and queen worked in tandem, bridging north and south in a way not seen in generations. Yet Sansa sometimes wandered the halls at night and felt the weight of the Red Keep's dark corners. Memories of that dreadful day on the steps of the Great September could never be erased. She dreamed of her father kneeling before the mob, of Joffrey's cruel voice, of the sword that fell. She would awaken trembling, tears streaking her face. More than once, she found Robert pacing in the moonlight, tormented by his own nightmares. Though they did not speak of it, they understood each other's grief. On one such night, she gathered her courage and approached him, laying a gentle hand on his shoulder. He glanced over. "Weary? I can never undo it," he said, the words catching in his throat. Sansa didn't flinch. "Nor can I," she whispered. "But perhaps we can ensure it never happens again." He stared at her a moment, then nodded. In that unspoken vow, they found a shared purpose. In time, the illusions of princesshood that Sansa had once held gave way to a more grounded sense of duty. She found that she took solace in seeing the northern bannermen come to court and be treated fairly, in ensuring the harvest shipments reached the impoverished corners of the city, in speaking softly with the king when his temper threatened to flare. Some nights, she penned letters to her mother, telling of the small steps forward. Lady Catelyn's replies were cautious but warm, reporting that Winterfell stood strong and that Bran and Rickon were well, that Arya remained missing though they hoped for her safe return. Each letter was a bittersweet reminder of what Sansa had left behind. She imagined that if Ned could see her, he might recognize she was no longer the naive girl who loved lemon cakes and songs above all else. The world had forced her to grow. More months passed. The threat of full-scale war diminished further. King Robert called a great council to formalize the realm's alliances. Lords from every region converged on King's Landing for the largest gathering since the coronation. Among them came Renly Baratheon, who greeted Sansa politely, though she sensed a certain envy in his gaze, perhaps that Robert had found a renewed sense of kingship that made his own ambitions futile. Stannis Baratheon did not attend, still smoldering on Dragonstone, but he sent an envoy. House Tully arrived in force, reuniting Sansa with her mother once again. The Tyrells came with lavish gifts. The Martells, though grudgingly, sent a delegation, still not entirely forgetting Elaya's murder. Even a representative of the Night's Watch attended, Blackcloak trailing. Over several days, in the echoing halls of the Red Keep, the lords debated matters of trade, boundaries, and taxes. The new queen presided at Robert's side, a living testament to the alliance that had bridged old wounds. It was a victory for both Starks and Baratheons and for the realm. Sansa found herself at the heart of it all, quietly but surely offering opinions and bridging divides. She recalled how once she had dreaded the thought of politics. Now she saw it could be a means to spare the land from needless bloodshed. At the council's conclusion, a feast was held more splendid than any since Sansa had first arrived in King's Landing. Tables groaned under the weight of spiced boar, roast swan, honey cakes, and sugared fruits. Musicians played lively tunes. The hall was decked with golden banners of the crowned stag intertwined with the grey dire wolf. Lords drank and laughed, perhaps for the first time in many moons, feeling the tension of looming war ease. Sansa, sitting beside Robert, gazed across the throng. She saw her mother smiling wistfully, Robb conversing with some southern lord, Marjorie Tyrell dancing, and even Tyrion Lannister, who had emerged from the shadows for the occasion, wearing a guarded expression as if unsure where he now belonged in this new order. Above them, torches flamed against the vaulting ceilings. Sansa reflected on the cruelty and heartbreak it had taken to reach this fragile peace. She could not forget the price, but she was determined to ensure it had not been paid in vain. Robert, well into his cups but not drunk, leaned over and said in a low rumble, "We should do this more often, my queen." She arched a brow. "What is that, your grace?" He gestured grandly to the hall, where men and women mingled, toasting alliances rather than hurling threats. "Gather as one. Gods, the realm has seen too much war. If we can keep the wolves and stags side by side, we might just spare these people another generation of bloodshed." His voice carried a note of earnest hope. Sansa's lips curved into a small smile. "Yes," she answered softly. "If we stand together." He reached for her hand, a gesture that felt awkward yet sincere, and she let him take it. The crowd was too busy feasting to pay them much heed, but it was a small moment of unity between them, king and queen. She squeezed his fingers once, gently. She thought of her father, of how proud he would be to see the realm forging a chance at peace. Tears pricked her eyes, but they were as much from a strange, budding hope as from grief. Even in the best of times, the future remained uncertain. There were rumors of dragons in the east, talk of Daenerys Targaryen stirring. The Iron Islands threatened rebellion from time to time. The Vales region, Lisa Arryn, was erratic and fearful. Across the narrow sea, Sellsword companies might be hired by anyone with gold. The shadows of old grudges lingered. But on that night, in the Red Keep, the new king and queen offered a symbol of unity rarely seen. The memory of Eddard Stark's death would forever cast a shadow on King's Landing, yet from that darkness, something unexpected had grown, a second chance for Robert to uphold the ideals he once shared with Ned, and for Sansa Stark to rise into the role of a queen who remembered what it meant to stand for honor, compassion, and the well-being of the realm. Over the coming years, their union would continue to face trials. Lords would test Robert's will, foreign powers would test the realm's mettle, and Sansa's own heart would at times yearn for the quiet snows of Winterfell. But each challenge found them more prepared than before, guided by the memory of the man who had brought them together in spirit, if not in life. Sansa would remind Robert of the duty he owed to the people he ruled, and Robert would remind her of the strength needed to shepherd a realm. In time, the small folk might speak of the Wolf Queen and the Stag King, how their marriage ensured that the North would not rebel, that the South would not break away, how they cleansed the capital of the worst Lannister corruption, how they guided Westeros through a precarious era. Ballads would be written, though never as grand as the tales of Aegon the Conqueror. Yet for those who lived through it, it was enough that the swords stayed sheathed more often than not. On a crisp morning, as the air hinted of winter's final approach, Sansa walked the battlements again. She wore a cloak of thick gray wool, clasped with a golden stag brooch. Her breath misted in the air. Below, the city sprawled, a patchwork of slate rooftops, winding streets, the distant glimmer of the sea. She had learned every contour of these walls since she first arrived as a frightened girl. Now, she was a queen who had found her footing. She felt a presence at her side. Robert approached, gaze traveling over the city he had fought so many battles to claim. He let out a breath. "The men say winter is closing in fast this year." Sansa nodded. "Yes. Food must be rationed carefully, especially for the poor. I've already spoken to the stewards." He gave a small grunt of approval. They stood side by side, the wind tugging at their cloaks. Then, in a moment of reflection, Robert murmured, "I was wrong about many things, Sansa. I wish your father could see we're trying to do better." Her voice was soft with conviction. "I think he can, in a way. We owe it to him to keep trying." Robert inhaled and nodded. Together, they gazed over the capital they now ruled, mindful of the cost at which this fragile peace had been bought. In the distance, gulls wheeled over Blackwater Bay, their cries echoing on the wind, as if heralding a future that, for once, did not seem wholly bleak. Many believed that a marriage begun in blood and tragedy could never bear fruit. But as the months became years, the king and queen learned from one another. Robert, scarred though he was, found a semblance of the leader he once aspired to be. Sansa, tempered by sorrow, found the resolve to shape the realm with compassion. They faced trials both grand and small, from the petty intrigues of court to the ominous signs of White Walkers in the far north, rumors that few believed. But they held firm. Ravensun would carry the tidings of new challenges, new conflicts, but each time the crown responded not by descending into cruelty or despair, but by steady governance. For Sansa Stark Baratheon, it was not the life she had envisioned as a girl in Winterfell, but it was the path fate had laid before her. She strove to walk it with the memory of Ned Stark illuminating her steps, forging a new future one careful decision at a time. Thus, beneath the watchful eyes of gods old and new, under the battered crowns of the stag and the direwolf banners interwoven, a measure of hope came to the Seven Kingdoms. The name Eddard Stark was spoken with reverence in the Red Keep, a name that had become the bedrock upon which Robert's second chance was built. And when the northern snows fell and the southern rains poured, the bells of King's Landing rang out to herald each victory of peace over war, each resolution over vengeance. For if there was one lesson gleaned from the darkness that took Eddard Stark's life, it was that the realm stood stronger when joined by honor and decency than it ever had through fear and treachery. And so the king and queen prayed it would remain for as long as they bore the weight of the Iron Throne and beyond, hoping that the memory of Ned Stark's final sacrifice would guide not just them but generations yet to come. The moonlight fell in faint ribbons across the stone floors of the Red Keep, a pale glow illuminating the corridors that had borne witness to so many royal footsteps, so many bloody secrets. Though the hour was late, Queen Sansa Stark Baratheon found no rest in her bed. She rose quietly, donned a plain woolen robe over her nightdress, and slipped through the shadowed hallways without escort. A single candle in a silver holder guided her way. Here in King's Landing, the night did not grant the same serene hush she remembered from Winterfell's courtyards, where snow blanketed the world until all was muffled and still. Instead, the capital still teemed with murmured voices behind closed doors, the shuffle of servants, the watchful steps of gold cloaks on patrol. She passed beneath a narrow arch, stepping onto a small balcony that overlooked the courtyard. Far below, the torches of the night guard glimmered, bobbing like wary fireflies as men paced the walls. The city was never fully dark. Lanterns in side streets and smoky glows from taverns gave it a dim, restless life. In the distance, the Blackwater River gleamed silver under the moon's reflection. Sansa inhaled the crisp air, which carried the faint tang of brine from the bay. For a moment, she closed her eyes and recalled her last conversation with her mother, the persistent ache that never quite left her. Lady Catelyn was now back in Winterfell, tending to Bran and Rickon, sending periodic ravens to update Sansa on the North's well-being. It heartened Sansa to know her Emily endured, though Arya's whereabouts remained a mystery that weighed on them all. She turned from the balcony, intending to slip back to her chambers, but her ears caught the echo of footsteps against the flagstones. Unwilling to be found wandering at such an hour, she stepped into an alcove behind a stone pillar, pressing herself quietly against the cold wall. The steps drew nearer, and soon she recognized the shape of a tall man, broad of shoulder. His cloak was trimmed in fur, though not as thick as a northern cloak might be. The faint glint from an ornamental clasp revealed the crowned stag sigil of House Baratheon. She knew that stride. King Robert. He paused upon the same balcony where Sansa had just been. She saw him stand there, rigid, his face hidden in the gloom. Moonlight traced the contours of his brow, the thick line of his beard. After a moment, he pressed his palms against the stone balustrade, exhaling a long, tired sigh that whispered against the night. Sansa hesitated, torn between revealing herself or leaving him in peace. Finally, she eased from the alcove, allowing the candle's flickering glow to announce her presence. He turned at once, but upon seeing her, he merely let his shoulders relax a fraction. "Out at this hour, my queen," he said, keeping his voice low to avoid rousing any curious listeners nearby. "I could not sleep," Sansa answered softly, feeling her cheeks warm. "I thought a walk might soothe my thoughts." Robert nodded, turning back toward the courtyard below. "Seems I had the same notion." For a long moment, they stood together, the hush of the city their only companion. Since their marriage over a year ago, they had learned to dwell in each other's quiet presence, a contrast to the shouts and pomp of daily court life. Sansa had grown accustomed to the complicated current of emotions that roiled beneath his surface. He often wrestled with regret, with anger at the realm's betrayals, but as the moons passed, he had grown more measured, his once bellowing outbursts honed into something steadier, if still fierce when roused. Bad dreams, she ventured, recalling how often she saw him pacing in sleepless frustration, haunted by ghosts of battlefields and the memory of Ned Stark's final moments. He let out a grunt. Of a sort. I dream of the boar sometimes, the one that almost did me in before. He did not finish the sentence, but Sansa did not need him to. Before Joffrey executed Ned Stark. Before chaos engulfed the realm. Before Robert awakened to find that everything he thought he controlled had slipped between his fingers. And I dream of your father, he went on in a lower tone. I see him calling my name. But I'm too far away. Sansa's throat constricted. She gazed down at the torchlit courtyard, blinking back tears. They had come so far since that darkest day, forging an alliance between the Crown and the North, tempering Robert's fury at the Lannisters into a measured campaign for justice. Yet the memory of Ned Stark's death was an ache that refused to fade. He would be glad to see the realm more at peace, I think, she whispered. He'd be proud that we found a way to spare more bloodshed. Robert's eyes flicked toward her. The silver glow of the moon caught the lines on his face, etched there by war and worry. He would have wanted no more innocents to die, he agreed, voice soft as a distant drumbeat. Then, impulsively, he placed a hand on her shoulder. The warmth of his calloused palm was a quiet reassurance in the chill night. Go to bed, Sansa. I'll not keep you from your rest. Tomorrow we host envoys from across the narrow sea. He grimaced at the thought. I hear the Braavosi once again want something or other. It's always coin, ships, or both. She inclined her head, feeling oddly comforted by his presence. Good night, your grace, she whispered. He nodded, and as she turned to go, she glimpsed him staring out over the city once more, a solitary figure burdened by the responsibilities of a realm and the guilt he still carried. She slipped back to her bedchamber, the candles flame dancing with each step. Once she might have dreaded such an encounter with the king. But time and the memory of Ned's trust had taught her that Robert Baratheon was no longer the careless, drunkard king who let the Lannisters rule through him. He was a man grappling with the consequences of his failures, striving now to preserve a realm that could so easily fracture again. And, in her own way, she strove beside him, shouldering the weight of queenship that she had never asked for but had embraced out of duty to the North, to her father's memory, and to the people who depended on stability. Sleep claimed her at last, though it brought uneasy dreams. She dreamed of Arya, alone in some distant place, searching for her way home. She dreamed of Robb, forging new treaties in the North, erecting defenses for the winter. And she dreamed of her father under the heart tree at Winterfell, telling her to stand strong but be kind. When dawn came, she awakened with her heart pounding, as though she had just heard Ned's voice echo in her mind. You must be brave, my little girl. She rose, determined to face whatever the new day held. That morning, the envoys arrived. For Braavosi representatives clad in sleek, dark finery stepped into the throne room with practiced grace. Their leader was a slim man with sharp features and an even sharper gaze, introducing himself as Kiero Nestoris, related presumably to the Nestoris bankers Sansa had heard mentioned in the small council. Robert sat upon the Iron Throne with his usual imposing air, a thick fur-trimmed robe draped over his broad shoulders to ward off the creeping chill that heralded winter. At his side, Sansa occupied a smaller but still notable seat of honor. The arrangement was a far cry from the days when Cersei Lannister had reigned as queen. The courtiers watched with interest as the Braavosi addressed Robert, requesting that the crown settle old debts incurred during the Lannisters' heyday and proposing new trade agreements. Robert's gaze flicked to Sansa briefly as the envoys spoke. He listened to their proposals, occasionally offering a curt nod or a blunt question. Once he would have drunk heavily throughout the proceedings, cracking jokes and swatting away concerns. But the man he had become was more deliberate, still gruff, still prone to impatience, but far less frivolous. The Braavosi, well-versed in reading men of power, sensed that King Robert was no fool to be brushed aside. Sansa added a few remarks of her own, cautioning that while Braavos' shipping lanes offered strategic trade benefits, the crown would not accept terms that undervalued their own ports. She recalled Marjorie Tyrell's gentle advice on trade matters: always let them see that you know your own worth. Robert offered her a nod of approval when she finished. The negotiations stretched into midday, leaving the courtiers restless and hungry, but eventually a tentative agreement was reached, one that promised Braavos certain privileges in King's Landing's harbor, in exchange for favorable loan terms and the assurance that the Iron Bank would not fund rebel causes within Westeros. Sansa watched the envoys depart, their postures betraying that they had not gained quite as much advantage as they had hoped. She felt a subtle glow of satisfaction that, at least in the realm of commerce, the crown was no longer so easily manipulated. When the throne room at last emptied, Robert and Sansa exchanged a few words of reflection. "They're cunning, these Bravosi," Robert muttered, clapping his gauntlet into the palm of his other hand. "One must read the small print on every parchment they offer." Sansa allowed herself a small smile. "So father used to say," she replied. Robert grunted in agreement. "Aye. And your father had the patience for it too. More than I ever did." A fleeting silence, then Robert rose from the throne with a weary exhalation. The clang of metal echoed on the stone floor as he descended to meet her. "I'll be off to the small council now," he informed her. "Best to finalize these matters while the ink's still fresh." She watched him stride away, thinking how much simpler everything might have been if Ned Stark still lived, if none of these tragedies had befallen them. But that was a fool's dream. They had only the present to navigate, and she vowed she would do so with the fortitude that Ned had instilled in her. Shortly after midday, Sansa retreated to the Queen's Solar, a tastefully furnished chamber awash in the cool light of the overcast sky. The windows overlooked the Red Keep's gardens, where a few autumn roses still clung to life despite the dropping temperatures. Within the Solar stood Marjorie Tyrell, waiting in subdued elegance, her lustrous hair coiled and pinned in a style that blended the southern fashions with a subtle nod to more practical forms. Marjorie offered a graceful curtsy. "My queen," she said warmly. "Marjorie," Sansa acknowledged with a slight inclination of her head and a weary smile. A handmaid hurried to pour fresh tea into porcelain cups, along with plates of small pastries dusted with sugar. Despite the realm's attempts to ration supplies for winter, the royal household still commanded delicacies most small folk would never see. Sansa sometimes felt uneasy about that disparity, but she also recognized that prestige fed authority in King's Landing. Appearances mattered, and to show weakness or hardship could invite opportunists to strike. "How went the morning's negotiations?" Marjorie inquired, sipping her tea in delicate fashion. "It was fruitful enough," Sansa replied. "The Bravosi pressed hard, but Robert was as stalwart as I've ever seen him in these matters. I think we reached a balanced agreement." Marjorie offered a thoughtful nod. "That is good to hear. With winter pressing, the crown will need all the alliances it can maintain. Highgarden stands ready to assist, of course, should famine threaten." Sansa gave her a grateful look. The alliance with House Tyrell had been a pillar of stability since the Lannisters' downfall. "Your help is most welcome," she said. "And your counsel as well, Marjorie. I know I owe you for the hints you gave me on negotiating with the Bravosi." Marjorie's lips curved into a demure smile. "I am pleased to be of service. My grandmother always said that half the realm's battles are fought not on the battlefield but at the negotiating table." Sansa's gaze shifted to the window, beyond which the sky threatened a gray drizzle. "True enough," she murmured, recalling how Robert's rebellion had once decided the fate of the Iron Throne through open warfare. Now a different sort of conflict pervaded, cunning words, alliances sealed or broken through subtle gestures, debts and trade routes that could shift loyalties in a heartbeat. Sometimes she feared it would be easier to face an enemy on the field than to unravel the complexities in the capital. They spoke a while longer of the realm's affairs. Marjorie informed Sansa that some minor lords near Casterly Rock were complaining about punitive taxes imposed on them to weaken the Lannisters. Sansa promised to bring the matter to Robert's attention, though it remained difficult to pity the Westerlands much, given their years of Lannister tyranny. Still, to truly unify the realm, they had to show fairness even to those who had once been enemies. Tyrion Lannister, the last of the family who walked free in the capital, though stripped of formal power, had quietly begun advocating on behalf of the lesser houses in the West. Sansa did not quite know what to make of Tyrion. He had ever been courteous to her, but her memories of Joffrey's cruelty still loomed. If she had learned anything, it was that underestimating a Lannister, any Lannister, could be dangerous. When they concluded, Marjorie prepared to take her leave, a swirl of rose-scented perfume trailing in her wake. Sansa sat in the now empty Solar, sipping the last of her tea, allowing her mind to drift. She wondered if Arya might somehow find her way to Winterfell, or if word of her sister might come by Raven from somewhere in the Riverlands. The helplessness of not knowing gnawed at Sansa daily, even though she had grown skilled at concealing her anxieties behind a queenly bearing. She placed her cup aside, folded her hands in her lap, and reminded herself that, in the Game of Thrones, patience was as vital as action. That afternoon, she joined Robert for another session of the Small Council, a group now composed of men chosen for their trustworthiness, or at least for their lack of hidden ties to House Lannister. Lord Giles Rosby served as Master of Coin, adequate if uninspired, while Lord Yon Royce of the Vale had been persuaded to become Master of Laws, given the relative neutrality of the Vale. Ser Barristan Selmy was a steadfast Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, more than once stepping into the council to lend moral weight to decisions. Grand Maester Pycelle had died some months ago, leaving the position to a younger maester, Harodin, who seemed mild and scholarly, with no taste for intrigues. Sansa had not fully decided if that was a blessing or a potential weakness. The famed Lord Varys was gone, vanished on some secret errand during the upheaval of Joffrey's dethroning, and had yet to resurface. Peter Baelish, known as Littlefinger, had lingered for a time, but Robert had swiftly dismissed him from the small council on suspicion that he had played some role in Ned Stark's downfall. Where Baelish had gone next, no one seemed certain. The meeting revolved around the state of the harvest, partial yields from the Reach, uncertain shipping routes from Essos, the state of the roads. Winter was tightening its grip across the north, and though the southern regions fared better, the crown had to ensure enough provisions to prevent famine or rebellion. Robert listened, occasionally drumming his fingers against the council table in impatience. Sansa offered quiet interjections, reminding them of the distribution efforts needed in Flea Bottom, the poorest district of King's Landing, where any sign of scarcity might spark a riot. At one point, as Lord Giles droned on about barley yields, Robert caught Sansa's eye. She recognized the flicker of frustration in him. Once he would have roared at Giles for putting half the council to sleep, but he simply clenched his jaw and let the man finish. It was a measure of his newfound restraint, a sign that he truly did strive to hold the realm together with a steadier hand. When the meeting finally drew to a close, Sansa followed Robert out into the corridor. He paused by a window, gaze turned to the sky. "We must pray the gods are kind this winter," he said. "We can't have half the realm starving." "We'll do what we can," Sansa said. "Highgarden's support is crucial, and I suspect House Martell may aid as well, if only to ensure the Lannisters remain contained in the west." Robert inclined his head grimly. "Yes, everything is politics, even hunger. If the Martells see advantage in giving bread to the crown, they'll do so." He let out a low sound that was neither quite a laugh nor a groan. "By the gods, I miss the days when I could simply swing a hammer and be done with my foes. This new war, the one with parchments and purses, is not to my taste." Sansa touched his arm gently. "It may be we face other wars, too. I've heard rumors from beyond the wall. Wildlings are stirring. There are stories in the north about," she hesitated. "About other threats, stranger ones." Robert snorted, but his face was not mocking. He was uneasy, she could tell. "I've heard the Ravens' reports. The Night's Watch begs for men. It's an old refrain. But if there's truly something amiss up there, we should be ready." His gaze flicked to her. "Your brother will keep me informed, won't he? Robb is in close contact with Castle Black. If there's danger, he'll send word. But yes, the watch is undermanned. They always are." She tried to quell the chill in her heart. Her father had once told her that the wall was not only for show. The idea of ice-eyed monsters lurking in the far north felt like a child's nightmare, but even nightmares could prove real in this world. Robert nodded. "We'll see to it that more supplies and men go north. Perhaps we can use a share of the Lannister gold we've confiscated for that purpose if the council agrees." Sansa felt a pang of relief. "I think that would please my brother, and indeed all the northern lords. They have been content so far with the new alliance, but they still watch carefully to see that the crown respects their concerns." "Then let it be so," Robert decided, looking more resolute. "We'll not have the north unsettled on my watch, not again. I owe Ned that much." He placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. "You've done well, Sansa. You speak for your people, and I hear you." A part of her heart clenched at the mention of her father, but she steeled herself, responding with a small, respectful bow of her head. "Thank you, Your Grace. My father's memory guides me." The following days brought a swirl of new tidings. A raven arrived from Castle Black, reporting that a fresh wave of wildlings was gathering under some self-styled king beyond the wall. There was no sign yet of anything more sinister, no whites or white walkers, but the Night's Watch remained on high alert. King Robert issued orders to gather men willing to take the Black, either criminals who might choose the wall over other sentences or volunteers seeking redemption and fortune. Though Joffrey Baratheon Lannister had been sent to the wall as part of his punishment, no one had heard a word about him since. Rumor said he remained sullen and cruel even in Black, spurning orders from his superiors, but the Watch had ways of dealing with unruly recruits. If Sansa felt any flicker of pity for Joffrey, it was drowned by memories of what he had done. She hoped the cold and the hardness of life on the wall might humble him, though she doubted it. In any case, it was a measure of justice that he was removed from power forever. Another raven came from Riverrun, carrying word from Edmure Tully. He wrote of bandits along the Trident, men wearing no sigil but rumored to have once served the Lannisters. They raided travelers, stole livestock, and vanished into the night. Edmure requested royal assistance to patrol the area. Robert conferred with Sansa and decided to dispatch a small contingent of loyal knights, those with no ties to the west. This was the price of preventing a larger war. Pockets of unrest still lingered, like embers that refused to die. Meanwhile, Tywin Lannister remained at Harrenhal. From time to time, an envoy from the west would arrive, seeking better terms for Jaime Lannister's release. But King Robert had shown no inclination to free the Kingslayer. In truth, Jaime's captivity had become a bargaining chip that kept Tywin in check. Cersei, still languishing in a well-guarded tower in King's Landing, was likewise a living reminder that House Lannister's power had been shattered. Sansa seldom thought of Cersei now, though occasionally she would catch sight of the tower's silhouette against the sky and feel a stir of remembered fear. The woman had once seemed an all-powerful queen, weaving cunning webs of deception. Now she was a prisoner, dethroned, despised, and cut off from her children, save for Myrcella and Tommen, whose parentage had likewise been exposed. Tommen lived under gentle wardship at Storm's End, and Myrcella had been sent to the Faith's care in a distant Septri, thereby blunting Tywin's ability to use either child as leverage. The realm looked on in orbed fascination, for rarely had a great house fallen so swiftly from its perch. On a brisk afternoon, Sansa wandered into the royal sept to pray. The stained glass windows threw colored shards of light onto the marble floor, flickering over the statues of the Seven. She knelt, hands clasped, and thought of the old gods as well as the new, not quite certain which to appeal to. Her father had prayed to the Weirwoods, her mother to the Seven. It seemed safer to honor them all, for the realm rested on the brink of so many potential catastrophes. She whispered for Arya's safe return, for Bran and Rickon's well-being, for Robb's wisdom, and for the king's temperance. Then she rose, feeling the hush of the sept wrap around her. She almost startled when she saw Tyrion Lannister standing by a column near the exit, his mismatched eyes fixed on her. He bowed with surprising courtesy. "My queen," he said, voice echoing faintly in the sacred space. Sansa took a measured breath. She had little cause to exchange words with him, but it would be rude to walk away without acknowledgement. "My lord," she replied, her tone guarded yet polite. Tyrion studied her with an inscrutable look. "You pray for the realm, no doubt. A queen's burden." "I pray for many things," she said. "Peace foremost among them." He nodded. "An admirable wish. My father would have mocked it, I suspect. He thrives in conflict, or did until recently." The mention of Tywin Lannister felt like a faint chill creeping up Sansa's spine, but she stood her ground. "And you, my lord? Do you thrive in conflict?" A flicker of a smile twisted his lips. "Once I might have said yes. Now, I'm not so certain. There's been enough bloodshed to last us a few lifetimes." He paused, letting his gaze drift to the statue of the mother. "I find no joy in my family's downfall, let me assure you. But I did see that your father was an honorable man, and his death was a travesty." Sansa was not sure how to respond. This was a Lannister, after all, but also the one who had shown her small courtesies when Joffrey tormented her. "I appreciate your sentiment, my lord," she said quietly. "Though words alone cannot undo what was done." Tyrion inclined his head. "No, they cannot. But if there is anything I can do to help preserve this peace, perhaps you or King Robert will let me know." She studied him, trying to discern his motive. House Lannister's fortunes were at rock bottom. Tyrion might simply be seeking any path to survive and retain a shred of influence. Yet there was a certain frankness in his eyes. "I shall remember, Lord Tyrion," she said at last. "But I caution you, the realm has not forgotten your family's crimes. Tread carefully." A wry twist of his mouth. "I always have, my queen. My legs are short, but I am adept at sidestepping pitfalls." With that enigmatic remark, he bowed again and departed, leaving Sansa alone in the sept. She found her pulse racing with the tension of speaking so openly to a Lannister. Yet she could not deny that Tyrion was more complex than Cersei or Joffrey. She made a mental note to inform Robert of the conversation, unsure if it mattered in the grand scheme of things, but unwilling to keep secrets. That evening, she joined the king for supper in the small dining hall, an affair far less grand than the feasts of old, reflecting Robert's shift toward pragmatism. A handful of loyal courtiers and knights were present, though not the entire swarm that once had dined on the royal coin. The conversation ranged from the Braavosi negotiations to rumors of the Iron Islanders stirring again. Robert sat at the head of the table, occasionally sending a side glance at Sansa to gauge her mood. She noted that he drank less than he once would have, limiting himself to a single cup of strong wine. When the meal ended, King Robert rose, excused himself to the lords present, and motioned for Sansa to follow him into a smaller adjoining chamber. There, a warm brazier glowed, chasing the autumn chill from the stones. He closed the door behind her, leaning against it with a sigh. "I feel the weight of this day," he muttered, rotating his shoulders as if they were stiff. "Tell me, Sansa, do you think the realm truly stands on stable ground? Or are we only delaying another storm?" She considered the question carefully. The recollection of her meeting with Tyrion Lannister still lingered. "We have peace, but it's a delicate peace," she answered. "One that could break under strain. Too many grudges remain. House Lannister in the west, the Ironborn sniffing for weakness, the wildlings in the far north, and talk of Targaryens in Essos." "Ah, the Targaryens," Robert said, voice turning dark. "Viserys may be dead, but that sister of his— what was her name?" "Daenerys," Sansa supplied, remembering the old rumors. "They call her the Stormborn. Word is she wed a Dothraki Khal, then lost him and took up with some band of exiles. And there are whispers she has dragons." Robert scoffed, though without full conviction. "Dragons, a child's tale. Still, the thought of Targaryen whelps across the sea sets me on edge. I bled enough the first time we took this throne." He shook his head, as if banishing the specter. "Well, one war at a time. So long as the lords of Westeros see the crown as strong, we might avoid a second rebellion. Or a second dance of dragons. 7 forbid." Sansa recognized the shadows behind his words. He feared losing the throne to the Targaryen claim, or to any upstart. Perhaps he also feared repeating the cycle of violence that had cost him Ned Stark. "We'll keep watch," she said gently, "and we'll act if necessary. But let us not squander our strength on chasing shadows. We have real enemies close at hand." He grunted, crossing to a sideboard to pour himself a small measure of wine. He offered Sansa a glass as well, and she accepted, though she only sipped. "I spoke with the council about the north," he said after a moment. "We can spare a few hundred men, maybe more, to reinforce the wall. The treasury curses me for it. But I won't see the realm undone by neglecting the watchers on that damned ice." Sansa felt a surge of gratitude, thinking of her brother and the uncertain dangers that might lurk beyond the wall. "Thank you, Robert. That will mean a great deal to the north." He waved a hand, dismissive. "To your father, I made a vow. I would protect the realm we fought to forge. The north is part of that realm." Then his gaze flicked over the rim of his cup. "Besides, if we keep the north content, they'll not rise again in rebellion. I know your brother is loyal, but the northern lords can be prickly." She allowed a faint smile, remembering Great John Umber and his roar at the Red Wedding in the original timeline that never came to pass. "They are indeed," she said, "but they respect strength, and they value the crown's acknowledgement of their burdens. Sending men and supplies will be well received." Robert nodded, appearing satisfied. Then he set his cup aside, stepping toward the brazier. The firelight painted the planes of his face in orange hues, bringing out the old battle scars that etched his brow. "Tomorrow, I'll be hearing more petitions from the Riverlands. You will stand with me, I trust." "Of course," she said immediately, though she found these endless lines of petitioners tedious and often heartbreaking. Farmers begging for tax relief, widows protesting injustice, minor lords squabbling over boundaries. But she would endure it, for it was part of her role, and each petition, however small, shaped the tapestry of the realm's stability. He eyed her, then let out a low grunt that might have been a laugh. "You have more patience than I, Sansa. Sometimes I recall how I used to be in the days of the rebellion. Each day was blood and thunder, battle cries and the clang of steel. War was simpler if more vicious. Now we walk the narrow edge, balancing 1,000 concerns. Gold, grain, honor, alliances." She inclined her head. "War is simpler, perhaps, but if we can keep the realm from bathing in blood again, we must. Even if it means listening to petitions until our ears fall off." He gave a curt nod, a trace of a smile in his beard. "You speak sense, as always." Then he rubbed his neck, sighing. "Go rest. If I have to endure more talk of barley and lost goats tomorrow, I'll need a clear head. And I'd prefer you rested enough to keep me from losing my temper." Sansa managed a soft laugh, surprising herself with the ease of it. "I'll do my best, Your Grace. Good night." He murmured a reply, and she slipped out into the corridor, her mind churning with the day's revelations. Sometimes she felt she was living in a dream. Never had she imagined becoming queen under such circumstances. Never had she imagined forging this odd partnership with Robert Baratheon. Yet here she stood, a Stark of the North, ensuring that the realm did not tear itself apart once more. If she felt a pang of longing for her old innocence, she reminded herself that innocence had been a luxury she could no longer afford. In the week that followed, the flow of petitions was relentless. Sansa listened alongside Robert as villagers and petty lords from the Riverlands, the Crownlands, even some from the Dornish marches, came seeking justice or redress. Some pleaded for relief from bandits, others from unscrupulous tax collectors. A few had disputes with neighbors over farmland. While Robert's impatience occasionally flared, Sansa stepped in to propose measured solutions. She realized the petitioners were relieved to see a Stark, for House Stark had a reputation for fairness that seemed to transcend the usual cynicism of southern courts. More and more, Robert allowed Sansa to finalize the judgments, especially on smaller disputes, trusting her sense of justice. She was mindful to consult with the Master of Laws, Lord Royce, ensuring the letter of the realm's rules was observed. Over time, she began to develop a subtle confidence. She might not be a warrior queen like Rhaenys Targaryen of old, but she could be a just one, shaping the land not through conquest but through upholding law and mercy. Outside the capital, rumors abounded. Sansa heard scattered reports that Tywin Lannister was ill. Some said he was coughing blood. Others claimed it was only a ploy, that Tywin feigned weakness to lure the crown into complacency. Robert took no chances, dispatching scouts to keep watch on Harrenhal's environs. In the Westerlands, lesser houses jockeyed for position, uncertain if Tywin would survive and if Jaime or Cersei could ever be freed. Tyrion remained in King's Landing, living in a modest suite of rooms, seldom venturing out except to attend the royal sept or to dine occasionally with a few acquaintances. Sansa suspected Tyrion had some plan in motion, though she could not guess its shape. So long as he caused no trouble, Robert let him be. One morning, a raven arrived from Winterfell. Sansa's heart fluttered when the maester delivered it to her hand. The seal of House Stark was pressed into the wax. She broke it carefully and read Robb's letter with both eagerness and dread. He wrote that the North was bracing for a harsh winter and that House Bolton, ever a prickly ally, had submitted to him grudgingly. He also said that men on the wall had glimpsed large gatherings of wildlings to the far north, though no major breach had occurred. He concluded by urging the crown to keep sending supplies and willing recruits. Of Arya, there was still no word. Lady Catelyn prayed each day for her safe return, but the roads were dangerous. Winterfell, though stable, remained haunted by the absence of Ned Stark and the unknown fate of Arya. Sansa penned a reply at once, offering what comfort she could and assuring Robb that the crown remained committed to reinforcing the wall. She expressed her longing to see him again, to visit Winterfell if circumstances allowed. But she knew in her heart that the realm needed her here, by Robert's side, at least for now. She sealed the parchment with the Baratheon stag and the Stark direwolf, side by side, a tangible symbol of the unity they had forged. Shortly afterward, a commotion arose in the yard, drawing Sansa to the battlements. She looked down to see a battered band of travelers arriving through the gate, escorted by gold cloaks. Among them were men wearing the cloaks of knights from the Stormlands, bearing injuries that suggested a recent battle. Word spread swiftly. They had encountered a roving band of Sellswords near the Blackwater Rush, claiming loyalty to no lord but rumored to have once served House Lannister. The men had refused to surrender to the royal party, forcing a skirmish. The Stormland Knights had won, but at a cost. Robert, arriving at Sansa's side, swore under his breath, "These ragged mercenaries will keep harrying us until Tywin's ghost is laid to rest. Or until they find a new patron. We must send a stronger message." She watched the bloodied men limp toward the keep. "Perhaps we can root out their camps. They cannot be numerous. We've soldiers enough in the Crownlands to scour them out if we prioritize it." Robert nodded grimly. "I'll see to it. Lord Royce can dispatch some men to clear the roads. We can't have banditry on the doorstep of the capital." He glanced at her, eyes narrowed. "You see, Sansa? Even in peacetime, there's always blood to be spilled." She felt her pulse quicken. "We do what must be done," she said, recalling Ned's creed, "He who passes the sentence should swing the sword." Though Robert might not literally swing the sword himself these days, he bore the burden of every sentence. She stood by him, feeling the intangible weight of the crown upon them both. In the weeks to come, raids against these rogue cells wards commenced. Reports trickled in of small skirmishes, captured prisoners, hideouts burned. Lord Royce coordinated with the Gold Cloaks to ensure the roads near King's Landing were safer than they had been in years. Sansa saw relief in the faces of the merchants who came to court, no longer terrified that their caravans would vanish into the night. This was the daily labor of ruling, squelching threats, dispensing justice, strengthening alliances. Step by slow step, the realm felt more secure. Then an envoy arrived from across the sea, bearing news that Daenerys Targaryen had indeed taken up residence in the city of Meereen with a ragtag following of freed slaves and sells words. The envoy claimed she possessed living dragons, small but growing. Many in the court scoffed, but Sansa recalled the old tales of House Targaryen's might. She saw how Robert's knuckles whitened when the envoy repeated the rumor. King or not, he had reason to fear a return of Dragonfire. Robert barked at the envoy to leave them, unsettled by the recollection that once the Targaryens had conquered all of Westeros with 3 dragons. Even a single dragon might upset the tenuous balance of power. In the private council that followed, Robert debated vigorously with the lords about the Targaryen threat. Some, especially older knights who had fought in Robert's rebellion, insisted they must send assassins or an army to destroy her while she remained across the sea. Others urged caution, pointing out how precarious the realm still was, how enormous the cost of a foreign war might be, and how the small folk might revolt at further taxes. Sansa, compelled by memory of the devastation war had wrought, ventured that it would be unwise to spark a new conflict before Daenerys made any move toward Westeros. The lords were divided. In the end, Robert opted for watchfulness. They would keep spies in Essos ready to warn if Daenerys Targaryen attempted an invasion. Meanwhile, no immediate strike would be launched. Sansa found herself surprisingly relieved. She did not relish the thought of sending faceless killers to murder a young woman across the sea. If dragons were more than myth, it would come to war eventually, but for now they had no proof of an imminent threat. "We have enough foes at home," she told Robert. "If Daenerys has truly claimed Meereen, let her remain there. Perhaps she desires only to build her own domain in Essos." Robert's lip curled at the notion of any Targaryen domain anywhere, but he conceded with a reluctant nod. "We'll keep our swords sheathed for the moment," he allowed. "But if she sets foot on Westerosi shores, I'll not have half the realm championing the dragon's return. We must be ready to crush it before it grows." The months continued to slip by, each day a delicate dance of alliances, threatened or confirmed. Winter's chill deepened. Couriers arrived with letters from the north describing heavy snowfall around Winterfell and even heavier snow in the lands beyond the wall. Sansa shivered, recalling the bleak whiteness of a northern winter. But she knew that if they had not mended the crown's relationship with the north, King's Landing would be facing a far harsher storm: rebellion, chaos, the fracturing of the 7 kingdoms. Instead, the realm held. The lines of communication with Robb remained open. Catelyn wrote that Bran and Rickon were healthy, though they missed their sister fiercely. For Arya, no word had surfaced, though rumors of a daring young girl with a sword dancing across the riverlands cropped up here and there. Sansa prayed they were true. During one of those winter nights, a royal feast was held, fewer in number than the old days, but still a chance to stir up some warmth and cheer. Trestle tables were brought into the great hall, loaded with hearty fare. Stewed venison, roasted turnips, loaves of coarse black bread, honeyed wine, mulled ale. Minstrels played lively tunes to distract from the biting cold outside. Sansa sat with Robert at the high table. She wore a gown of dark blue velvet, trimmed with white fur that evoked the stark colors, and a simpler crown than Cersei had once flaunted. Robert, too, was dressed more plainly than in the past, though he still cut a formidable figure with his barrel chest and heavy arms, the memory of warrior's strength never far from him. As the evening progressed, Sansa found herself speaking with various lords who came to pay homage. A cluster of them was newly arrived from the Vale, bringing queries from Lady Lisa Arryn, still reluctant to open her gates fully but no longer openly hostile. Lord Royce, tall and proud, introduced them to the king. Robert boomed welcomes while Sansa listened for any trace of discontent that might grow into rebellion. Fortunately, the Vale men seemed content so long as the Vale's neutrality was respected. Nearby, Marjorie Tyrell danced with a young Stormlands knight, capturing the attention of half the hall. Her grace and beauty drew admiration, and Sansa was grateful for her presence. Marjorie had become a subtle pillar of the new regime, bridging the gap between Highgarden and King's Landing. Even so, Sansa occasionally spotted a flicker of calculation in Marjorie's eyes, a reminder that House Tyrell always looked after its own interests. She would have to remain wary, but that was the nature of power in Westeros. No bond was ever entirely free of self-interest. By the feast's midpoint, a hush fell at the arrival of someone unexpected. Tyrion Lannister had entered, accompanied by no fanfare. He wore modest clothing in black and crimson, the colors of his house, though the lion's sigil was absent. He paused near the hall's entrance, uncertain whether to proceed. Sansa felt the eyes of the hall turn upon him. Many remembered the Lannister name with venom. She noticed Marjorie pause mid-step, her partner faltering. Robert scowled, but then gave a slight nod, permitting Tyrion to enter. The dwarf approached the high tea. Abel, inclining his head. "Your Grace, my queen." Robert's voice was loud in the hush. "Lannister, it's a feast. If you've come to dine, do so. If you've come to cause trouble, I'll have you thrown to the black cells." Tyrion raised his eyebrows. "Merely to dine, I assure you, and perhaps to show I hold no ill will for the new order." He offered a small bow. Sansa could see half the hall was bristling, uncertain whether to chase him off or ignore him. She decided to offer a graceful acceptance. "Be welcome, Lord Tyrion," she said. "Though we do not forget the past, if your intent is peace, you may break bread here." The tension broke somewhat, and Tyrion thanked her before moving to a seat near the end of a table, quietly pouring himself wine. Conversations resumed, though pockets of courtiers kept glancing his way. A curious hush lingered whenever he shifted in his seat or spoke to the servants. Tyrion sipped, ignoring the stares. He had learned to endure far worse. The feast continued, music resumed, and lords tried to outdo each other in tales of hunts or daring deeds. Robert drank more than usual that night, though still less than in his old, reckless days. Once or twice, Sansa noticed him glaring at Tyrion as though remembering that the man's father still threatened from Harrenhal. But the king let it pass, focusing instead on the enjoyment of the night. Eventually, couples started dancing again, and Sansa found herself coaxed into a dance by a gallant young knight from the Reach. She moved through the motions gracefully, recalling the dancing lessons of her youth, though her heart was not as light as it once might have been. When the final notes of the music died away and the feast began to wane, Tyrion approached again, this time offering thanks for the courtesy of admission. Before Robert could dismiss him, Sansa nodded. "You came without guard or pretense, Lord Tyrion. That suggests sincerity, at least." He spread his hands. "I have no appetite for vengeance, my queen. I have no illusions about reclaiming my family's old glory. If I can find a place in this new realm that doesn't involve a headman's block, that will suffice." Robert exhaled through his nose, finishing the last of his ale. "See that you don't try to sow any chaos in my city." Tyrion's eyes flicked to Sansa, then back to Robert. "Chaos does not serve me, nor you. I suspect we both prefer order now, for our different reasons." He inclined his head again and departed, leaving the king scowling after him. Later, Sansa observed to Robert that Tyrion might be truly seeking survival rather than scheming. Robert gave a snort, saying, "A Lannister always schemes, even when cornered," but he no longer seemed quite so eager to throw Tyrion into the dungeon. Sansa suspected that as long as Tyrion remained docile, Robert would leave him be. Winter deepened. Frost rimed the windows in the Red Keep. Fires burned in the hearths day and night. Merchants spoke of snowfall in the Stormlands, a rarity that had travelers slipping on icy roads. Yet still, the realm held together. Sansa attended daily councils, fielding demands from the Iron Islands, ever restless, and from Dorne, which continued to harbor grievances over old Targaryen-era slights. The Tyrells pressed for certain trade concessions in the north. House Aaron's regent in the Eyrie complained about mountain clans raiding. And through it all, the message was clear: the stability of this alliance between House Baratheon and House Stark was all that prevented a cascade of open conflict. Even so, from time to time, Sansa felt the old pang of loneliness. She missed her sister, her younger brothers, the comfort of Winterfell's snowy courtyards. Here, she had to maintain a vigilant grace, never letting her composure slip. Only in the Godwood, beside the small weirwood, could she let her tears flow, remembering Ned Stark's voice and the warmth of family she had lost. On one such day, when she knelt in the Godwood, she sensed a presence behind her. It was Robert again. She rose, quickly wiping her eyes. He studied her in silence, then placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "I miss him too," he said, voice hushed. "I miss the days when I could turn and find him at my side, ever loyal." She swallowed hard. The sincerity in his tone touched her. "I know," she whispered. "We do what we must to honor him." "Yes," Robert muttered, glancing at the red leaves of the weirwood. "I hope we're doing right by him, Sansa. Every day, I hope." Tom drifted like snow on the wind. Another moon's turn, another swirl of petty conflicts, more bandit raids here or there, more cautious negotiations. One late afternoon, a party arrived from the Night's Watch, led by a ranger with streaks of gray in his hair. He bore a parchment sealed by the Lord Commander, requesting further manpower and supplies. Robert, mindful of his promise, granted them 300 men, some criminals, some eager volunteers. Sansa met with the ranger privately, pressing him for news of the far north. He confessed that more and more wildlings had been seen, fleeing something behind them, a terror they would not name. Rumors of pale figures lurking in the snow haunted their whispers. Sansa suppressed a shiver. She had heard these stories from Old Man in Winterfell, but hearing a veteran ranger speak of them added a new weight. When the ranger departed with fresh recruits and wagons of supplies, Sansa prayed that if any true darkness stirred in the lands of always winter, the Night's Watch would stand firm. It was near the year's turn when a raven arrived, bearing a seal that made Sansa's heart jump: House Tully's fish. She read it in private, a message from her mother. Lady Catelyn wrote that Arya had been sighted in the Riverlands, that she traveled with a group of young companions, rumored to be seeking passage north. The details were scarce. Some claimed Arya had used a different name, or that she carried a sword named Needle. But it was enough for hope to flare in Sansa's chest. She hurried to show Robert. He read it, eyebrows raised. "Your sister is alive, then. The last Stark unaccounted for." Sansa nodded, scarcely containing her emotion. "If it's true, if she's truly near the Riverlands, perhaps we can arrange an escort for her. She's only a child, traveling alone in dangerous lands." Robert set the parchment down. "We can dispatch a search party, but if she's hiding from Lannister forces, she might hide from our soldiers as well." Sansa chewed her lip. "If we send men under the Stark banner, or Tully men, she might come willingly." He considered, then nodded. "Send a raven to your uncle Edmure. Have him gather a few trusted men, no more than a dozen. Tell him to look for your sister discreetly. If she's indeed traveling near the Trident, they might find her before she's lost to some bandit blade. Gods know the roads are full of scoundrels." Sansa exhaled relief. "Thank you," she whispered. For all their alliance and shared governance, these personal matters still felt deeply fragile to her. If we find her, I'd want her brought here. I know she'd prefer Winterfell, but you want to see her," Robert finished, a trace of understanding in his gravelly tone. "Yes, and it might be safer in King's Landing than on the roads north at this time of year. If you find her, bring her. The castle is large enough for another Stark." Hope flickered through Sansa in a way she hadn't felt since before her father's death. She hurried to pen the raven that very evening, urging Edmure to keep an eye out for Arya. The candle burned low as she wrote, her script neat but trembling with emotion. In the days that followed, she tried to go about her duties calmly, though she found her mind drifting to images of Arya, half wild, wearing tattered breeches, her hair cropped short, brandishing Needle. She prayed that Arya would not slip away before Edmure's men could find her. Another fortnight passed, with no immediate news. Sansa began to despair, fearing the rumor had been false. Then, Late one windy afternoon, a grizzled messenger arrived from Riverrun, breathless from hard riding. He delivered a sealed message directly to Sansa's hands. She read it in the presence of Robert and almost wept for joy. Arya had been found near an abandoned mill, traveling with a small group of ragged youths. She was alive, though in rough condition, suspicious of any uniformed men. But Edmure's knights, recognized for their Tully banners, had persuaded her they meant no harm by invoking the name of her mother and father. She was now under escort, making her way south along the King's Road toward the capital. Sansa pressed a hand to her chest, hardly believing the words. "She's safe," she breathed. "Arya's safe. She's coming here." Robert gave a decisive nod, summoning a servant to bring wine. This time, a cause for genuine celebration. "We'll give her a proper welcome," he said, voice kinder than usual. "And if she's anything like the stories say, we'll have our hands full." "A girl with a sword. Ned once mentioned she was a fierce one." Sansa smiled through tears. "She is fierce, and I love her for it." They made preparations at once. A suite of chambers was readied for Arya in the Red Keep. Sansa ordered the cooks to plan a warm meal upon her arrival, not a lavish feast, but something hearty: pigeon pie, fresh bread, and hot mulled cider. All the while, she felt a flutter of nervousness. Arya had changed, no doubt. Perhaps she bore resentments about their father's death, about Sansa's role as queen. Perhaps she had grown savage on the roads. But none of that mattered if only she would let Sansa embrace her again, if only they could be sisters once more. Word came that Arya would arrive within a few days. Robert sent a small contingent of gold cloaks and a trustworthy knight to escort her the final stretch, ensuring no bandits ambushed them. Sansa paced each morning, peering from the castle's walls, searching for the first sign of the traveling party. On a cold, fog-shrouded day, they finally appeared on the horizon, a column of riders trudging through the city gates. Sansa raced down to the courtyard, ignoring decorum, ignoring the curious stares of courtiers. She arrived just in time to see the horses clatter in, their breath steaming. A cluster of men in Tully livery led them, among them a few youths who looked battered by the road. And there was Arya, small, lean, dressed in patched breeches and a cloak too large for her. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair a wild tangle half-grown out from a rough cut. She slid off her horse, glaring at the gold cloaks as though expecting a trap. Then her eyes fell upon Sansa. She froze. For a long, trembling moment, neither spoke. Sansa felt tears roll down her cheeks. She took a tentative step forward. "Arya," she managed, her voice breaking. "It's me. Io." But Arya was already running, flinging herself into her sister's arms. Sansa stumbled back from the force, holding her tight, sobs escaping her in ragged bursts. Arya clung to her as though drowning, face buried in Sansa's shoulder. "They killed father," Arya choked out, the words muffled. "They killed him, and I couldn't." "I know," Sansa whispered, stroking her sister's grimy hair, tears streaming down her own face. "I'm so sorry. Gods, I'm so sorry, Arya." She felt Arya's trembling, the pent-up grief that had nowhere else to go. She held her for what felt like an eternity, neither caring who watched or what they thought. In that moment, she was not a queen, nor was Arya some vagrant child. They were two Stark girls who had lost their father. At length, Arya pulled back, swiping at her tears with the back of her hand. She looked Sansa over with a strange mixture of awe and wariness. "You're queen now," she said, voice rough. "They told me. I didn't believe it at first." Sansa gave a small, broken laugh, wiping her own tears. "I didn't believe it either. But here we are." She saw Arya's hand still clutched a thin sword, needle, no doubt. The same sword Jon Snow had once given her. "Come inside," Sansa said gently. "We have food and a warm bed. You're safe now." Arya nodded, but her eyes flicked around the courtyard, still suspicious. She noticed Robert standing at a short distance, observing them with a somber expression. The king stepped forward, dismissing the gold cloaks with a gesture. "Arya Stark," Robert said quietly, "welcome to King's Landing. I was your father's friend. I owe him everything." Arya's grip on Needle tightened. She stared at him, uncertain. Sansa feared an outburst. But then Arya merely said, "You didn't save him." Her voice trembled with pain. Robert's face spasmed. He bowed his head. "No," he admitted, "I did not. I failed him. I'm trying now to mend what I can. Let me start by offering you safety here." Arya glanced at Sansa, then back at Robert, and finally gave a small nod, though her expression remained taut. Sansa silently thanked whatever gods oversaw this moment. They led Arya into the Red Keep, and Sansa felt the tension in her sister, the disbelief, the overwhelming wave of sensations after so many hardships on the road. In the days that followed, Sansa insisted that Arya be given clean clothing, a proper bath, and a chance to rest. Arya bristled at the fuss, but she did not refuse outright. She devoured the meal of pigeon pie like she hadn't eaten in days, and when Sansa gently tried to comb her hair, she allowed it grudgingly, though she complained that it tugged too much. The two sisters spoke late into the nights, locked in the privacy of Arya's new chamber. Arya recounted her escape from King's Landing, how Yoren of the Night's Watch had tried to protect her, how she had wandered the Riverlands, seeing horrors of war up close. She asked after their brothers, after their mother. Sansa answered as best she could, stumbling over the complexities of her new life as queen, the precarious alliance, the daily balancing act. Arya listened with wide eyes, occasionally muttering that none of it felt real. On the third day after Arya's arrival, Robert summoned both Stark sisters to a private reception. Sansa dressed simply, wanting to put Arya at ease, though she still had to wear her circlet of queenship. Arya wore a serviceable tunic and breeches under a plain cloak, refusing to don dresses no matter how gently Sansa suggested it. The reception was small, just Robert, Sansa, Ser Barristan and Selmy, and a couple of high-ranking knights. The king formally acknowledged Arya as a ward of the crown under Sansa's personal care. He promised that once winter eased, she would be free to travel to Winterfell or remain here as she wished. Arya said little, but Sansa saw the mixture of relief and lingering anger behind her eyes. Afterwards, Robert drew Sansa aside. "Your sister's a brave one," he said. "I can see Ned in her." Sansa swallowed hard. "She is. She always has been." He paused. "If she hates me, I'll not blame her. But I hope, in time, she'll see that I intend no harm." Sansa gave a faint, appreciative smile. "Give her time, Robert. She lost so much. But she'll see the changes you've made. She'll see we're trying to do what's right." The king nodded, and for a moment he looked truly weary. "Yes, time. That's all we can do, it seems." In the days that followed, Arya explored the Red Keep, always keeping Needle at her hip. She sparred with some of the gold cloaks in the training yard, to their surprise and occasional dismay. She was quick and agile, a flurry of jabs that belied her youth. Sansa caught glimpses of her sister racing down corridors or prowling along the parapets. Often, Arya would vanish for hours, only to return with scuffed boots and new stories of hidden corners in the castle. Sansa's initial worry lessened as she saw that the guards had begun to show Arya an odd respect, and that Robert had ordered them to let the girl roam as she pleased, so long as she posed no threat. It was, in its own strange way, a healing time for Arya, though she still had nightmares that made her thrash and cry out in the night. Sansa did what she could to comfort her, recalling her own nightmares of Ned's execution. They never truly left, but perhaps sharing them might dull the edge. Each morning, they would break their fast together, speaking in hushed tones about the North, about memories of Winterfell, about the father they both missed. Arya never asked Sansa in detail about her marriage to Robert, perhaps finding it too strange to contemplate, but she did ask with blunt directness, "Is he kind to you?" Sansa hesitated only a moment before nodding. "He is. Not gentle always, but he's not cruel. He bears guilt for father." Arya had studied her face, then looked away with a complex expression. "Good," was all she said. Thus, the Red Keep found a new rhythm, with Arya Stark's presence bringing a bit of unvarnished honesty to its corridors. She cared nothing for courtly graces, openly disdained the flatterers and sycophants who slunk around the queen's presence. Her scorn for them amused Robert on occasion, though it also worried him that her candor might cause trouble in the labyrinth of southern politics. Sansa tried to guide Arya, explaining that caution was sometimes necessary, but Arya would only shrug, muttering that caution had nearly killed her a dozen times on the road. Spring, though slow in coming, finally approached. The cold loosened its hold on the Crownlands. Sansa received letters from Winterfell, describing blizzards that made roads impassable. Even with the difficulties, Robb Stark held the North together. Whispers circulated that Balon Greyjoy might test the northern coasts again, but thus far no major raids had occurred. Tywin Lannister's health reportedly continued to decline, but still no word came of whether he intended to break his forced neutrality. The realm stood in a strange equilibrium, neither wholly at peace nor at war. Meanwhile, rumors of Daenerys Targaryen reached new ears. Travelers from Essos spoke in hushed excitement of a breaker of chains who freed slaves across the cities of Slavers Bay, who had 3 dragons, no longer hatchlings but growing fiercer by the day. Robert grew restless whenever the subject arose, pacing the council chamber and questioning whether they should act. Yet the consensus remained that a foreign war, launched across the sea, would be ruinous if Daenerys posed no immediate threat. The Crown had the Iron Islands, the Wildlings, and Tywin Lannister's smoldering resentments to worry about closer to home. Amid these uncertainties, Sansa stood in the Godwood once more, beside Arya. They had come here to remember their father on the anniversary of his death. The red leaves rustled overhead, a whisper of secrets older than any realm. Arya stared up at the carved face in the weirwood, its eyes weeping red sap. "I miss him," she said simply, voice rough. Sansa slipped an arm around her sister's shoulders. "So do I," she murmured. They stood there, letting the hush envelop them. In the distance, the noise of King's Landing felt far away. Arya turned, her gray eyes earnest. "One day, I'll go back to Winterfell. Will you come with me?" Sansa bit her lip. She longed for the north, yet she had made a vow as queen, bound to Robert for the sake of the realm. "Someday," she whispered, "if the realm is secure. If Robert can spare me. I want to see home again." Arya nodded, though her disappointment was clear. "I understand," she said, though her voice quivered. "I just want us all together again." Sansa closed her eyes. "I know." The wind stirred, carrying with it the faintest hint of salt from the sea, a reminder that they were far from the heart of the N. Orth. As they turned to leave the Godwood, Robert appeared at the entrance, a dark cloak draped over his broad shoulders. He paused, perhaps not wanting to intrude, then cleared his throat softly. "Sansa, Arya," he greeted them, voice subdued. "I came to pay my respects as well." "Your father," he trailed off, seemingly at a loss. Arya studied him, then gave a slight nod, stepping aside so Robert could approach the heart tree. The king stood there, massive hands clasped in front of him, as though uncertain how one prayed to the old gods. Finally, he bowed his head, a gesture of contrition. Sansa watched, tears pricking her eyes. Even Arya said nothing, her usual scorn tempered by the raw solemnity of the moment. In that quiet clearing, the 3 of them remembered Ned Stark in their own way, Sansa with tears and prayer, Arya with clenched fists and silent vows of vengeance, Robert with regret and a whispered apology for the friend he had lost. The old gods did not speak, but the rustle of leaves felt like an acknowledgement. When they left the Godwood, returning to the bustle of the Red Keep, none of them spoke of the moment, yet each carried its echo in their hearts. Thus the alliance between the Crown and House Stark deepened, shaped by grief, guilt, hope, and a resolve to protect what Ned Stark had died defending. The realm was far from safe, threats lurked at every edge, from the rumored dragons across the sea to Tywin's final machinations, from the restless Ironborn to the rumors of ice wights beyond the wall, but for now, at least, the wolves and the stags stood together. In the capital, small folk spoke of Queen Sansa's gentle but firm hand, of King Robert's renewed commitment to justice, of the young she-wolf Arya stalking the halls. And they dared to hope that perhaps the 7 kingdoms would not be plunged into another age of blood and fire. It was a fragile hope, but a hope nonetheless. And sometimes fragile hopes proved the strongest kind, for they were forged in sorrow and tested by adversity. Each dawn, Sansa awoke, reminding herself that Ned Stark's memory lived in her choices, in her compassion, and in the alliances she helped shape. Each dusk, Robert stood upon the walls, his gaze traveling the horizon as though watching for the ghosts of his past. And Arya prowled the corridors, training in secret corners, determined to never again be powerless. The realm continued on, precariously balanced, yet undergirded by the bond of a Stark-Crown alliance that might one day see Westeros through its darkest nights. If the winter grew darker still, they would face it together, in the name of the friend, father, and lord whose legacy guided them all.